When New Zealanders are given a task, or even better, when there's just a thing that needs doing that you haven't been asked to do, you just go ahead and do it. You don't necessarily overthink it. You do whatever needs to be done. Great, thank you, Sky. So Kirsten and I arrived in the US from New Zealand in 1996. And actually, how many people have been here? How many people arrived here, I guess, before like 1990? Anyone? Yes. We'll hear from Helen in a moment, and a couple of people here. Fantastic. Who arrived during the 90s? The moderately old guard, excellent. And who arrived here in the 2000s? Like 2000, 2010, and then everybody else, I guess, arrived since 2010? Awesome. So we have a range of vintages, I guess, in this group, which is great, and I think that's part of the point of this group, which is to share maybe some of the war stories and recommendations from folks who've been here a bit longer with folks who are more recent arrivals. When I think about New Zealanders in the US, actually, I'll give a quick but slightly longer summary of what Kirsten and I have been doing in the US since '96. I originally came to do a postdoc at Stanford. I did a PhD at Waikato in computer science and, of course, undergraduate at Canterbury. I know Rod's here, so I can't say Waikato more than I say Canterbury. In computer science, and then at that point in time, 1996, was about when the first whole genomes were being sequenced of small organisms, so bacteria, viruses, and so on. And they started to work on the human genome sequence. And so biology was kind of turning from a science that was sort of focused on the wet lab, so in vitro experiments, which means in glass, in vivo experiments, in living things, and that was sort of transitioning to what they started calling in silico. That is, in a computer, actually doing a lot of the analysis, because now we have, this essentially digital information, which is really what the DNA is in our cells. They had actually copies of that now, and we could do analysis on computers. So I spent a couple of years in the biochemistry department at Stanford working on some of the early ideas around how you would do medicine and understand health and so on in using computational techniques. So that was a lot of fun, and I bumped into, at the time, Larry and Sergey, who were PhD students at that point. Larry Page and Sergey Brin were the founders of Google, and they had built something originally called Backrub, but fortunately renamed to Google, which didn't make any more sense, but was maybe more appropriate. Kirsten and I moved out to New York. I twisted Kirsten's arm a little bit to try living in New York City, a lot. Was a professor out in New Jersey at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, but we really wanted to live in New York itself, and so I commuted out there. We lived just downtown, actually, and did work in bioinformatics, but also information retrieval, which I'd been doing a little bit of back in New Zealand. And then Larry sent me, a couple of years, so about a year into that, Larry Page sent me an email saying, we're actually starting a company now, you should come and join. And so I obviously responded, no, I'm an academic, I've got a bunch of grants and some grad students, but I'll pass it on to my grad students. I've kept that email. And then my postdoc advisor back in Stanford said, I'm going away for the summer. Would you be willing to look after my lab while I'm gone? So I went there for the summer, visited a friend who had actually gone to Google, realized that it was a pretty interesting place, and emailed Kirsten, I think, or called her and said, how do you feel about moving to California? Which she didn't feel great about either at that point. So we moved back to California, both excited about Google, and then Kirsten joined Google once she got work permission. But we really missed New York City, and so we desperately wanted to move back to New York. I know you guys are getting like whiplash at this point. And after 2 years being at Google, I actually had a leave of absence from Rutgers and said, to Larry, I would I really want to stay at Google, but we really want to move back to New York. And I could just leave my Google job, go back to academia, which, by the way, I probably wasn't going to do. Or maybe we need an office in New York. And so at that point, all of the software engineers at Google were in sort of a 300-meter radius. They're all together in one place in Mountain View. And so the idea of having people 2,500 miles away seemed a little crazy. And Larry, Sergey, and Eric did think it was pretty crazy. They also thought there wasn't much downside, right? If Kirsten and I moved out and we couldn't hire really great people, then they said, you either have to move back to California or quit. So we're like, okay, we'll take that risk. So we moved out here. Kirsten at that point was recruiting for Sheryl Sandberg's team, who had started out the AdWords product, which turns out to be lucrative in retrospect, and had started recruiting people around the world, in Ireland and India and eventually New Zealand and all over. I started up the engineering office here. It turned out we did find lots of really, really great software engineers. The threshold was 15. Larry and Sergey and Eric said if you can hire 15 people, you can stay, and if not, you have to move back. So now I think there are 5,000 in the New York office, so we're good. Anyway, and more recently, I've left Google and gone to another alphabet company, Sidewalk Labs, as Sky mentioned. So that's a super quick summary. But to broaden out a little bit and think about the kinds of things that, in retrospect, were helpful or good, I kind of think a little bit about, you all know that the myth of Superman, right? I mean, maybe he's real, but I assume he's mythical. And he came from Krypton to Earth, and when he arrived, he had superpowers because Krypton's sun was much larger, yada, yada. Not sure of the physics exactly. So just because of the different environments, he actually had superpowers, but he also had this Achilles heel, which is kryptonite. Again, not clear what the physics is there exactly either, but it's sort of an analogy a little bit, I think, for New Zealanders coming to the US. And so it's interesting to think about what are our superpowers when we come to the US and what's our kryptonite. And I suspect each of you will have ideas about this, but a few of mine were, I think one of our kryptonites is, and this is all cliched, by the way, you're probably going to say, oh, this is all totally obvious, but is the tall poppy syndrome. The fact that in New Zealand, you don't really want to excel in a way that makes yourself obvious, and you certainly wouldn't want to tell somebody that you were good at something. You would essentially just do a really good job, and eventually they figure it out. But if you explicitly told them, that would be, that would cut yourself off at the knees. And I remember at Stanford talking to these other grad students, and they'd talk about the work they did, and I'd look at the resumes, and I'd be like, these people are amazing. I suck. And then that was sort of initially, and then sort of 6 to 12 months later, as I got to know them better, I'm like, they are really, really good, but I'm also quite good as well. And I'm like, why? It's interesting because, why did I think they were so great? And it was that they weren't being boastful. They just sort of told me what they were good at. And they told me the things that they'd done in a way that a New Zealander just wouldn't. And I think that actually accrues mostly negatively to us in the US. That it's not necessary to be boastful, but it is necessary to tell people the things that you think you're good at and the things that you've done well in a way that you don't apologize for. You know how in New Zealand if somebody gives you a compliment, you have to explain to them in some detail why that's not true. You don't have to do that here. It's okay if somebody gives you a compliment to say, thank you, and sort of leave it at that. So I think that's our kryptonite. On the other hand, we do have some superpowers. And these are not totally unrelated, but I feel like when New Zealanders are given a task, or even better, when there's just a thing that needs doing that you haven't been asked to do, you just go ahead and do it. You don't necessarily overthink it. You do whatever needs to be done. I think a lot of my colleagues in different stages of my career have sort of come from very professional backgrounds where they sort of think they're sort of above a lot of things that actually need to get done. And the fact that I think as New Zealanders, it's that number 8 wire, pioneer, farming mentality, you just get on and do it. Whether it's the thing that you're trained to do or whether it's just something that has to happen. And you also don't necessarily think, well, I'm trained as a lawyer and this thing is a technical issue, so therefore I'm going to find somebody else to do it. You're like, oh, I can learn about that. I can figure that out. How hard could it possibly be? Maybe it doesn't work out 100% of the time, but in general, I think it's a good attitude. The idea of just sort of getting on with it. What was I about to say? Well, I had it for a second. I'll go back to one of the superpowers, I think, is our accent. People think we sound British. In fact, people will say to you, "You're British, aren't you?" And you're like, no, they're pretty proud of this. But I think the fact that we sound Britishy makes us all sound smarter. So I think we should, we shouldn't take advantage of that too much, but it does, I think, there is some presumption that we sound sort of on average smarter than the average American. To an American ear, I don't really understand it, but it seems to be true. I was trying to think of the last superpower. It's actually this group. We're a small enough country that we're not so small that we always know each other when we meet each other randomly, or that we're just 1 degree apart. But we're small enough that when you meet a Kiwi, you go the extra mile to sort of help them out, to introduce them to people, to give them advice. I think in general we don't feel competitive with each other because there aren't enough of us to sort of feel like you're competing with a bunch of New Zealanders. And so I think groups like these are incredibly important and benefit from the fact that we are a moderately small country. And we kind of root for each other in the American sense of that phrase. Sorry, I wasn't planning to say that. But by the way, be careful. There are phrases that go in the other direction. So watch out for phrases that don't mean the same thing in both cultures. I'm gonna quit while I'm behind. Okay, thank you.